The auction block stood empty now. The crowd dispersed into the bitter Montana wind, but Martha Richardson could still feel every pair of eyes that had watched her climb those wooden steps. The schoolteacher's hands trembled as she signed the marriage certificate, her signature shaky beside the bold scrawl of Kenneth Cox. The wounded trapper sat rigid in his chair, his left leg stretched awkwardly before him, wrapped in blood-stained bandages. His daughter Elizabeth Hughes clung to Martha's skirts, her small fingers twisted in the fabric as if afraid this new mother might vanish like smoke. The preacher's wife, Sandra Mendoza, whispered urgently to her husband, her voice carrying across the small cabin, despite her attempts at discretion. What kind of woman bought a man at auction, and especially one so broken he could barely stand? What kind of father allowed himself to be sold like livestock to pay his debts? The questions hung in the air like the smoke from the dying fire, acrid and suffocating. Kenneth's jaw tightened as he heard the whispers, his weathered hands clenching into fists on his thighs. The bear trap that had nearly taken his leg 3 months ago had done more than damage bone and sinew. It had shattered his pride, his ability to provide for Elizabeth, his very sense of himself as a man. Now he sat in a stranger's cabin, legally bound to a woman who had paid his debts with her late husband's savings, watching his 5-year-old daughter seek comfort from arms that weren't his own. Martha felt the weight of every stare, every whispered judgment, but she kept her spine straight and her voice steady as she spoke the vows that would bind her to this broken man and his frightened child. She had lost her own husband, Anthony Thompson, to pneumonia 2 winters past, had buried her baby son, Jason Wood, before his first birthday, had taught other people's children while her own arms remained empty. When she heard about the trapper's situation, about the little girl who might be sent to an orphanage if her father couldn't pay his medical debts, something deep inside her chest had cracked open like ice in spring. The wedding ceremony ended with no kiss, no celebration, only the scratching of the preacher's pen as he recorded their union in his ledger. Elizabeth looked up at Martha with eyes the same pale blue as her father's, searching for something Martha wasn't sure she could provide. The child had watched her mother die in childbirth, had seen her father carried home more dead than alive after his encounter with the bear, had lived with the constant fear that she too might be taken away. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The story had begun 6 months earlier, when Martha first heard Elizabeth's name whispered in the mercantile. The little girl had been living with the widow Carol Ramos while her father recovered, but Carol's own children were grown and gone, and she couldn't afford another mouth to feed through the harsh Montana winter. Kenneth Cox had been the best trapper in 3 counties before his accident, but now he could barely walk, let alone navigate the treacherous mountain paths where the best pelts were found. Martha had seen them together only once before the auction, when Carol brought Elizabeth to town for supplies. The child had pressed herself against her father's good side, her small hand resting on his shoulder as he leaned heavily on his makeshift crutch. Kenneth's face had been gray with pain and something deeper, a hollow desperation that Martha recognized from her own mirror in the months after Anthony's death. She had watched them from the schoolhouse window, noting how gently he spoke to his daughter, how carefully he listened to her childish chatter about the birds she'd seen, the flowers she'd picked. The auction itself had been a spectacle that would be talked about for years to come. Jason Johnson, the banker who held Kenneth's medical debts, had reluctantly agreed to the arrangement after Kenneth himself suggested it. Better to be bound in marriage to a woman who could care for Elizabeth than to see his daughter shipped off to strangers in the territorial capital. The crowd that gathered was equal parts curious and scandalized, drawn by the unprecedented nature of the event. Martha had worn her best dress, the blue wool that brought out her eyes, though she wasn't sure why it mattered. She had braided her dark hair severely back, trying to look respectable and capable rather than desperate. At 32, she was considered well past her prime for marriage, too old to bear children, too set in her ways to be a proper wife. But she had her own small house, her teaching salary, and most importantly, a fierce need to matter in someone's life again. Kenneth had been cleaned up for the occasion, his beard trimmed, his hair washed, wearing what must have been his only good shirt. But nothing could hide the pain that creased his face with every movement, or the shame that burned in his eyes as he sat before the crowd, like a prize bull at a county fair. He was 35, still handsome despite the lines that suffering had carved around his eyes, still strong in the shoulders and arms though his leg might never fully heal. The bidding had been brief and brutal. Martha's voice had rung out clear and steady as she offered to pay Kenneth's debts in full, to take responsibility for both father and daughter, to provide them with a home and stability. No one else had spoken. The silence that followed her bid had stretched like a taut wire, until Jason Johnson's gavel fell with a sound like breaking wood. Elizabeth had been waiting in Carol's wagon during the auction, but Martha could see her small face pressed against the canvas cover, watching with the solemn intensity that seemed too old for her years. When it was over, when the papers were signed and the money changed hands, Kenneth had limped to the wagon and lifted his daughter down with arms that shook from more than just physical weakness. The three of them had walked to Martha's cabin in silence, Elizabeth between them, her hand in Martha's, while Kenneth struggled with his crutch on the uneven ground. Neighbors watched from their windows, curtains twitching as the strange new family passed. Martha felt their judgment like a physical weight, but she kept her head high and her steps steady. Her cabin was small but clean, with 2 bedrooms and a main room that served as kitchen, dining area, and parlor. She had prepared as best she could, moving her few belongings to make room for Kenneth and Elizabeth's possessions. The child's few dresses and toys fit easily in the smaller bedroom, while Kenneth's trapping gear and personal effects filled only one corner of the main room. That first night had been awkward beyond description. Martha prepared a simple supper of salt pork and beans, her hands steady despite the tremor in her voice, when she asked Elizabeth about her preferences. The little girl ate in silence, glancing between her father and her new stepmother with wary eyes. Kenneth barely touched his food, his jaw tight with pain and something that might have been humiliation. When it came time for bed, Martha had shown Elizabeth to her room, helped her into her nightgown, and tucked her under the quilts with gentle efficiency. The child had submitted to these ministrations without protest, but also without warmth, her body rigid under Martha's touch. Martha had read her a story from one of the few children's books she owned, her voice soft in the lamplight. But Elizabeth's eyes remained fixed on the doorway, where her father stood watching. Kenneth slept on the floor by the fire that first night, despite Martha's offer of the larger bedroom. She could hear him shifting restlessly, trying to find a position that didn't aggravate his injured leg. Several times she considered going to him, offering laudanum for the pain or simply another blanket. But something held her back. He was her husband now in the eyes of the law and the church, but they were strangers bound together by necessity and desperation, rather than love or even affection. The days that followed fell into an uneasy routine. Martha continued teaching at the one-room schoolhouse, walking the mile each way while Kenneth stayed home with Elizabeth. His leg was improving slowly, but he still couldn't manage the rough terrain that trapping required. Instead, he threw himself into repairing things around Martha's property, mending the chicken coop, fixing loose boards on the porch, splitting firewood with grim determination. Elizabeth remained polite but distant, calling Martha ma'am and following her instructions without question, but showing no signs of genuine affection. Martha tried not to let it sting, reminding herself that the child had already lost one mother and had every reason to guard her heart carefully. But late at night, lying alone in her bed while her new family slept in the next room, Martha wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The town's reaction was everything she had expected and worse. Parents whispered when they brought their children to school, questioning whether a woman who would buy a husband at auction was fit to teach their sons and daughters. The preacher's wife, Sandra Mendoza, made pointed comments about the sanctity of marriage and the proper way for Christian unions to begin. Even her few friends seemed uncertain how to treat her, unsure whether to offer congratulations or condolences. Kenneth bore the worst of it. Men who had once respected him as a skilled trapper now looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. He had sold himself like a side of beef, they said, had let a woman pay his debts and take him into her home like a kept man. The fact that he couldn't yet return to his profession only made the whispers louder, the looks more pointed. 3 weeks into their strange marriage, Martha came home from school to find Kenneth teaching Elizabeth to whittle, his large hands guiding her small ones as she carved a rough bird from a piece of pine. The sight stopped her in her tracks. her heart clenching at the tenderness in his voice as he praised his daughter's efforts. This was what she had hoped to preserve, she realized, this bond between father and child that was worth any amount of gossip or social ostracism. That evening, after Elizabeth was asleep, Martha and Kenneth sat by the fire in companionable silence for the first time since their wedding. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and Martha found herself studying her husband's profile, noting the way pain had carved lines around his eyes, the careful way he held his injured leg. He was a handsome man despite his suffering, with the kind of quiet strength that came from years of surviving in the wilderness. Kenneth seemed to sense her scrutiny and turned to meet her gaze. For a moment something passed between them, an acknowledgement of their shared situation, and perhaps the first stirring of mutual respect. He spoke first, his voice rough from disuse. "I know this isn't what you wanted," he said quietly. "Marriage to a broken-down trapper with more debts than prospects. You could have had your pick of the unmarried men in town." Martha considered his words carefully before responding. "I'm 32 years old, Kenneth. I've been a widow for 2 years. And before that, I was married to a man who never saw me as anything more than a housekeeper who shared his bed. The unmarried men in town see a dried-up spinster school teacher with no children and too many opinions. You're wrong about what I wanted." He studied her face in the firelight, perhaps seeing her clearly for the first time. Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks under his scrutiny, but she didn't look away. She had spoken more honestly than she had intended, revealing more of her loneliness and disappointment than was wise. "What did you want then?" Kenneth asked, his voice gentler now. Martha was quiet for a long moment, listening to the wind rattling the windows and the soft sound of Elizabeth's breathing from the next room. "I wanted to matter to someone," she said finally. "I wanted to be needed, not just tolerated. I wanted to have a family again, even if it came to me in an unconventional way." Kenneth nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his pale eyes. "Elizabeth needs a mother," he said, "a real one, not just someone to feed her and keep her clean. She's been through too much for a child her age." "And what do you need?" Martha asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Kenneth's smile was rueful, touched with pain that had nothing to do with his injured leg. "I need to be a man again, to provide for my family, to protect them, to be worth something more than the debts I've accumulated. Right now, I can't even walk to the outhouse without that damn crutch." Martha felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of loneliness she had carried for so long. This man understood loss, understood the way grief could hollow you out until you felt like nothing more than a shell going through the motions of living. Perhaps their marriage was built on necessity rather than love, but it was also built on mutual understanding of what it meant to be broken and still keep fighting. The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Over the following weeks, they began to talk more freely, sharing stories of their past lives and their hopes for the future. Martha learned that Kenneth had been married before, to a gentle woman named Mary, who had died giving birth to Elizabeth. He had been a devoted husband and father, working long seasons in the mountains to provide for his small family, always returning home with gifts and stories of his adventures. Kenneth learned that Martha had always wanted children, but had suffered 3 miscarriages during her first marriage. Her husband Anthony had blamed her for their childlessness, growing cold and distant as the years passed without the sons he desperately wanted. When he died, Martha had felt grief mixed with a shameful sense of relief, finally free from the constant weight of his disappointment. Elizabeth began to warm to Martha gradually, drawn by her patient kindness and genuine interest in the child's thoughts and feelings. Martha read to her every night, helped her with simple letters and numbers, and listened with careful attention to her chatter about the animals she saw in the yard and the dreams that sometimes frightened her awake. The little girl still called her ma'am, but she began to seek Martha's comfort when she was hurt or scared, a development that filled Martha with fierce protective joy. As Kenneth's leg healed, he began to venture farther from the cabin, testing his strength and mobility on increasingly challenging terrain. The bone had knitted crookedly, leaving him with a permanent limp and a weakness that would prevent him from returning to his former life as a mountain trapper. But he was determined to find another way to contribute to their household, to reclaim some measure of his masculine pride. The solution came from an unexpected source. Zachary Phillips, who ran the town's small newspaper, approached Kenneth about writing articles about wilderness survival and hunting techniques. The territory was filling with settlers who knew nothing about living off the land, and Zachary believed Kenneth's knowledge could be valuable to readers. The pay wouldn't be much, but it would be honest work that Kenneth could do despite his physical limitations. Kenneth threw himself into the writing project with the same intensity he had once brought to tracking elk through mountain passes. His articles were detailed and practical, filled with hard-won wisdom about reading weather signs, finding water in drought conditions, and surviving unexpected storms. Martha helped him with the writing, her teaching experience proving valuable in organizing his thoughts and improving his grammar. The articles were popular with readers throughout the territory, and soon Zachary was receiving requests for Kenneth to expand his pieces into a guidebook for new settlers. The project gave Kenneth a sense of purpose he had thought lost forever, and Martha took pride in helping him craft his experiences into useful advice for others. Their partnership in this work brought them closer together, creating shared goals and mutual respect. Martha began to see Kenneth not as a burden she had taken on, but as a capable man adapting to changed circumstances with courage and determination. Kenneth began to see Martha not as his benefactor, but as his partner, someone whose intelligence and support made him stronger rather than weaker. Elizabeth flourished in this atmosphere of growing cooperation and affection. She began calling Martha Mama Martha, a compromise that acknowledged both her love for her birth mother and her growing attachment to the woman who was raising her. Her nightmares became less frequent, and she started bringing Martha small gifts, wildflowers, and interesting rocks that she thought her new mother would like. The town's attitude toward their unusual family began to shift as well, though slowly and not without resistance. Kenneth's articles brought positive attention to their community, and his growing reputation as a writer and wilderness expert helped counter some of the whispers about his auction marriage. Martha's steady competence as a teacher and her obvious devotion to Elizabeth gradually won over even some of her harshest critics. But not everyone was ready to accept their unconventional arrangement. Jason Johnson, the banker who had organized the auction, began making comments about the impropriety of their situation, suggesting that a marriage born of financial desperation couldn't be blessed by God. His wife, Kelly Kim, was even more vocal in her disapproval, organizing a group of church women to petition the school board about Martha's fitness to teach their children. The crisis came to a head on a cold November morning when Martha arrived at the schoolhouse to find a delegation of parents waiting for her. Led by Kelly Kim and Sandra Mendoza, they had come to inform her that her services were no longer needed. A woman who had bought a husband at auction, they declared, was not a suitable moral example for impressionable young minds. Martha felt the blood drain from her face as she listened to their accusations, but she kept her voice steady as she responded. She had been teaching their children for 4 years, she reminded them, and her personal life had never interfered with her professional duties. Her students were learning to read and write and cipher, which was what their parents claimed to want for them. But Kelly Kim was relentless, her voice rising with righteous indignation as she detailed Martha's moral failings. A proper Christian woman would have waited for God to provide her with a husband through natural means, not purchased one like a prize bull at a county fair. How could such a woman be trusted to instill proper values in their children? The confrontation might have ended Martha's teaching career and destroyed the fragile stability her family had built. But Elizabeth chose that moment to arrive at the schoolhouse. The little girl had been worried when Martha didn't return home at her usual time and had convinced Kenneth to let her walk to town to check on her new mother. Elizabeth's appearance changed the dynamic of the confrontation entirely. Here was the child that Martha's scandalous marriage had saved from the orphanage, healthy and happy and clearly loved. Kelly Kim's strident voice faltered as she looked at the little girl's trusting face, and several of the other parents shifted uncomfortably. Kenneth arrived moments later, his limp more pronounced from the cold weather, but his presence commanding despite his physical limitations. He had heard about the confrontation from a sympathetic neighbor and had come to support his wife. His quiet dignity as he took his place beside Martha was a stark contrast to the shrill accusations being leveled against her. The standoff was broken by an unexpected ally. Carol Ramos, the widow who had cared for Elizabeth after Kenneth's accident, pushed through the crowd of parents with fire in her eyes. She had watched Martha with Elizabeth, she declared, had seen the love and patience the school teacher showed the traumatized child. Any woman who would sacrifice her reputation to save a motherless girl from the orphanage was exactly the kind of person they should want teaching their children. Other voices began to join Carol's: parents who had seen their children's improvement under Martha's instruction, neighbors who had witnessed the Cox family's growing happiness and stability. The tide of opinion was turning, but Kelly Kim wasn't finished. She played her final card, threatening to take the matter to the territorial authorities if the school board didn't act. Kenneth stepped forward then, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had faced down grizzly bears and mountain storms. He spoke of his love for his daughter, of Martha's selfless decision to help them when no one else would, of the home they had built together based on mutual respect and shared responsibility. His words were simple but powerful, cutting through the hysteria and moral posturing to reach the hearts of his listeners. The confrontation ended not with Martha's dismissal, but with a grudging acceptance of her right to continue teaching. Several parents withdrew their children from her school, but others made a point of expressing their support. The crisis had forced the community to take sides, and while Martha's enemies remained vocal, she also discovered she had more friends than she had realized. That evening, as Martha prepared supper with hands that still trembled slightly from the day's ordeal, Kenneth came up behind her and placed his hands gently on her shoulders. She leaned back against his solid warmth, drawing strength from his presence. They had faced their first real test as a family and emerged stronger for it. Elizabeth chattered excitedly about her adventure walking to town by herself, proud of her role in defending her new mother. Martha listened with a heart full of love for this brave little girl who had chosen to claim her as family despite all the obstacles and opposition they faced. The winter that followed was the happiest Martha could remember in years. Kenneth's writing project expanded into a full-length book, and publishers in Denver and San Francisco expressed interest in his work. Martha helped him edit and organize the manuscript, their evening collaboration becoming a cherished routine. Elizabeth learned to read simple words and delighted in helping her parents with their work, carefully sharpening pencils and organizing papers with the serious concentration of a child given an important task. Their physical relationship remained chaste by mutual agreement, though Martha was increasingly aware of Kenneth as a man, rather than simply a household companion. She noticed the way his shoulders moved when he chopped wood, the gentle patience in his voice when he taught Elizabeth new skills, the consideration he showed in small daily gestures. He was careful never to presume upon their arrangement, always treating her with the respect due a lady rather than the familiarity of a true husband. But Martha found herself longing for more than respect and companionship. She wanted the warmth of his arms around her at night, the comfort of shared intimacy, the complete partnership that she had never known in her first marriage. The wanting was a sweet ache that grew stronger with each passing day, but she was afraid to risk the stability they had built by pushing for something Kenneth might not be ready to give. The decision was taken out of her hands on a bitter February night when Elizabeth woke with a high fever and labored breathing. Martha and Kenneth took turns sitting with her, bathing her burning skin with cool cloths and trying to coax her to drink water. The nearest doctor was 20 miles away, and the roads were impassable due to a recent blizzard. As Elizabeth's condition worsened, Martha felt the familiar panic of helplessness that had plagued her during her miscarriages. She was losing another child, she thought desperately, failing again in the most fundamental way a woman could fail. Kenneth must have seen the despair in her face because he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she fought back tears. "She's going to be all right," he whispered against her hair, his voice rough with his own fear. "We're going to get her through this together." Martha clung to his strength, drawing courage from his certainty, even as she felt her world threatening to collapse. They worked through the night as a team, Kenneth's wilderness knowledge complementing Martha's practical nursing skills. He brewed teas from herbs he had gathered and dried the previous summer, while Martha monitored Elizabeth's breathing and temperature with the precision of long experience caring for sick children. By dawn, Elizabeth's fever had broken, and she was sleeping peacefully for the first time in hours. Martha and Kenneth sat beside her bed, exhausted but relieved, their hands clasped tightly together. In the gray morning light, Martha realized that sometime during the long night of shared crisis, They had become truly married in every way that mattered except the physical. Kenneth seemed to reach the same realization. He turned to look at her, his pale eyes serious and questioning. Without words, he was asking if she was ready to take the final step, to make their marriage real in every sense. Martha's answer was in the way she leaned toward him, in the trust and love she let show in her face. Their first kiss was gentle and tentative, a question and an answer all at once. Martha felt years of loneliness and disappointment melt away in the warmth of Kenneth's embrace. This was what she had been searching for without knowing it, this sense of complete partnership and mutual devotion. Elizabeth recovered quickly from her illness, but the crisis had cemented the bonds between all three members of their family. She began calling Martha simply Mama, dropping the qualifier that had maintained a distance between them. Martha's heart overflowed with joy at this final acceptance, this gift of a daughter's complete trust and love. Spring brought new challenges and opportunities. Kenneth's book was accepted for publication with an advance that would allow them to improve their property and secure their financial future. Martha received an offer to teach at a larger school in the territorial capital, but she turned it down without hesitation. Her life was here now, with her husband and daughter, in the community that had finally accepted their unconventional family. The wedding that had stunned everyone with its unusual circumstances had evolved into something beautiful and lasting. Martha and Kenneth's marriage became a model for other couples in their community, proof that love could grow from the most practical of beginnings when nurtured by mutual respect and shared commitment. On their first anniversary, Kenneth surprised Martha with a proper wedding ring, a simple gold band that he had ordered from a jeweler in Denver. As he slipped it onto her finger, he spoke the words he had been unable to say a year earlier. "I love you, Martha Cox," he said, using her married name with pride and possession. "You saved my daughter's life and gave me back my own. I promise to spend the rest of my days trying to be worthy of the gift you've given us." Martha's response came through tears of joy. "You already are worthy, Kenneth. You always were. I'm the one who's been blessed beyond measure." Elizabeth watched the exchange with the satisfied expression of a child whose world has finally settled into the shape it was meant to have. She had her father back, strong and purposeful despite his physical limitations. She had a mother who loved her completely and unconditionally. Most importantly, she had a family that belonged together, bound not just by law or convenience, but by the deep ties of genuine affection and commitment. The townspeople who had once whispered about the scandalous auction marriage now spoke of the Cox family with respect and even admiration. Martha's teaching was more valued than ever, and Kenneth's reputation as a writer and wilderness expert brought honor to their community. Elizabeth grew into a confident, intelligent child who served as living proof that love could triumph over the most difficult circumstances. Years passed, and the Cox family's happiness only deepened with time. Kenneth's books became popular throughout the Western Territories, and he was frequently invited to speak at settler gatherings and territorial meetings. Martha continued teaching, eventually becoming the head teacher when the school board decided to expand their one-room schoolhouse into a proper academy. Elizabeth grew into a young woman who embodied the best qualities of both her parents, Kenneth's quiet strength and Martha's determined compassion. She never forgot that Martha had chosen to be her mother, and their bond remained unbreakable through all the challenges of adolescence and young adulthood. The auction that had brought them together became family legend, a story told with pride rather than shame. Martha and Kenneth would recount the tale to their grandchildren years later, emphasizing not the unusual circumstances, but the courage it had taken to build love from the foundation of mutual need and respect. Kenneth's leg never fully healed, but he learned to see his limitations as redirection rather than defeat. His writing gave him a way to share his wilderness knowledge with a much larger audience than he could ever have reached as a trapper. His influence extended far beyond their small Montana community, helping countless settlers survive and thrive in the challenging Western landscape. Martha found in her marriage to Kenneth everything she had dreamed of, but never dared hope for. She was not just tolerated but treasured, not just needed, but genuinely loved. Her opinions were valued, her intelligence respected, her contributions to their partnership recognized and appreciated. The loneliness that had defined her first marriage became a distant memory, replaced by the deep contentment of being truly known and accepted. Their physical relationship, when it finally developed, was everything Martha had hoped it could be. Kenneth approached her with the same patient gentleness he showed in all things, taking time to learn what pleased her, never demanding more than she was ready to give. Their intimacy grew naturally from their emotional connection, becoming another way they expressed their love and commitment to each other. The couple who had begun their marriage as strangers, bound by necessity, became partners in every sense of the word. They made decisions together, supported each other through difficulties, and celebrated each other's successes. Their home became a haven of warmth and stability, a place where love was expressed through daily acts of consideration and care. Elizabeth's presence enriched their marriage in ways neither Martha nor Kenneth had anticipated. Raising her together gave them shared purpose and joy, and her perspective often helped them see their own relationship more clearly. She was the bridge that had brought them together, but she became much more than that. She was the proof that their love could create something beautiful and lasting. As the years passed, Martha and Kenneth's marriage became a source of hope for other couples facing difficult circumstances. They proved that love didn't always begin with passion and romance, that sometimes the strongest relationships were built on foundations of mutual respect, shared values, and the determination to create something better together than either could achieve alone. The community that had once scorned their unconventional beginning eventually came to see the Cox family as one of its most valuable assets. Kenneth's expertise helped new settlers avoid dangerous mistakes, while Martha's teaching prepared their children for the challenges and opportunities of territorial life. Elizabeth grew up to marry well and raise her own family nearby, ensuring that the Cox legacy would continue for generations to come. Looking back on their journey from that first awkward wedding ceremony to the deep contentment of their later years, Martha and Kenneth marveled at the unexpected ways life could unfold. Neither had imagined when they spoke their vows that day that they were beginning one of the great love stories of their generation. They had simply been two broken people trying to survive, to protect what mattered most to them, to find some measure of dignity and purpose in the face of overwhelming challenges. The auction that had shocked their community became the foundation of a marriage that inspired it. Martha's courage in bidding on a wounded man and his daughter created ripple effects that touched countless lives. Other widows found hope in her example. Other wounded men found the strength to rebuild their lives. Other children discovered that families could be formed in unexpected ways. Kenneth's gratitude to Martha never dimmed, even as their relationship evolved into something far beyond obligation or appreciation. He remained amazed by her strength, her generosity, her willingness to risk everything for the sake of love. She had seen something in him worth saving when he couldn't see it himself, had believed in his value when the rest of the world saw only his limitations. Martha's love for Kenneth only deepened as she came to understand the full measure of his character. His gentleness with Elizabeth, his determination to contribute despite his physical challenges, his unwavering commitment to their family's welfare, all revealed a man of exceptional integrity and strength. She had thought she was rescuing him, but in many ways he had rescued her, giving her the family and purpose she had always longed for. Their story became part of the folklore of the Montana Territory, told and retold around countless campfires and dinner tables. It was a story of hope triumphing over despair, of love growing from the most unlikely soil, of the power of human connection to transform even the most desperate circumstances. The wedding that had stunned everyone became the beginning of a marriage that inspired everyone who witnessed it. Martha and Kenneth Cox proved that true love wasn't always about passion and romance, that sometimes the deepest connections were forged in the crucible of shared hardship and mutual support. Elizabeth never forgot the lesson of her parents' marriage, that love was a choice as much as a feeling, that commitment and respect could create bonds stronger than mere attraction. She carried this wisdom into her own relationships, building a marriage as strong and lasting as the one that had given her life stability and meaning. The school teacher who had shocked her community by bidding on a wounded trapper at auction became a beloved matriarch whose wisdom was sought by generations of families. The trapper who had thought his life was over when a bear trap shattered his leg became a celebrated author whose books helped shape the development of the American West. The little girl who had faced the orphanage became a woman who understood that love could come in many forms, all of them precious and worthy of protection. Their story endured because it spoke to fundamental truths about human nature and the power of love to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. It reminded people that worth wasn't measured by conventional standards, that courage could be found in the most unexpected places, that the greatest adventures often began with a single act of faith. Martha Richardson Cox lived to see her great-grandchildren, always telling them the story of how she met their great-grandfather at an auction, how she chose love over convention, how she discovered that the best things in life often came disguised as the most difficult challenges. Her eyes would sparkle as she described that first awkward wedding ceremony, the whispers and stares, the gradual transformation of suspicion into admiration. Kenneth Cox's books remained popular long after his death, his practical wisdom helping generations of settlers and adventurers navigate the challenges of frontier life. But his greatest legacy was the family he built with Martha, the love story that proved the most unconventional beginnings could lead to the most extraordinary endings. The auction block where their story began was eventually torn down and replaced by a proper town hall, but the memory of what had happened there lived on. It became a symbol of hope for anyone facing impossible circumstances, proof that love could triumph over the harshest judgment, that families could be formed by choice as surely as by blood. In the end, the wedding that stunned everyone became the foundation of a love that inspired everyone. Martha and Kenneth Cox showed their community and countless others that true marriage wasn't about perfect circumstances or conventional courtship, but about two people choosing to build something beautiful together, no matter how broken they might be when they started. Their story lived on in the hearts and minds of all who heard it, a testament to the transformative power of love, the strength of the human spirit, and the beautiful truth that sometimes the most scandalous beginnings could lead to the most sacred endings. The widowed school teacher and the wounded trapper had found in each other everything they had ever dreamed of and more, proving that love truly could conquer all.